This is the truth about linear progression and why a lot of coaches do get this wrong. Unfortunately, I've seen no end of programs, both from the CrossFit world and not, that don't properly make use of percentage-based training despite prescribing so-called accurate percentages. Linear progression, as a broad term, would suggest that just going up by a bit every week would be enough, and that is completely fine for a beginner. But where you're starting to program and prescribe percentages, there needs to be a bit more of an understanding of something called relative intensity, understanding what's reasonable for an athlete to actually progress by each week, but also understanding the correct start point for the rep scheme that you're actually planning on using. Coaches can sometimes fall into the trap of just picking a number for a percentage that sounds familiar, and then throughout the cycle sometimes increasing it by a little bit, sometimes increasing it by a lot. In reality, there is theory behind why you would use certain percentages at certain times in the training cycle, and if you're using a percentage-based load, the whole point of it is that it is the most accurate prescription that you could possibly give. Therefore, it needs to be backed by theory. So what is our starting point? Firstly, we refer to this table, and this gives us a percentage based off our 1 rep max for any given number of reps. So for example, if we were to go for 5 reps, we would see that on this chart is 87% of our 1 rep max. But what we need to remember is it's not just as simple as using 87% every time we want to perform 5 reps in the gym. We need to remember that that is effectively a 5 rep max, therefore it is a 100% effort. So we don't want to be going into the gym and performing a 100% effort at every opportunity that we have. Obviously that's going to lead to burnout and no end of things. This is where something called relative intensity comes in, and this is how we leave room for progressions week on week, so we actually have a chance to adapt from the training that we're putting ourselves through, which obviously begs the question, where do we start with our relative intensity and how do we work that out? So here it comes down to planning the progression. So we need to think about how long we want the training cycle to be, and that will allow us to know how many 2.5% jumps we're going to take in relative intensity throughout that training cycle. Generally, we use 2.5% jumps in relative intensity just to make sure that it's manageable, to make sure that it's not too much, and so that we can continue that adaptation throughout. We can, in various different scenarios, use slightly bigger ones, but for the purpose of this and keeping it simple, we're going to talk about 2.5% jumps. Let's just say that we are planning a 12-week training cycle. We're going to have 3 smaller cycles that make that up, all made up of 4 weeks. Normally, we're going to have 3 working weeks and then a deload before we carry on into that next smaller cycle. So we need to think about how many working weeks we've got. We're going to have 3 per cycle. 3 times 3 equals a total of 9 working weeks. Then we're going to do 9 working weeks times by 2.5%, because that is the progression, that is the jump we want to take for each of those weeks. That equals 22.5%. We're going to take that away from our raw 5 rep max number, just as we're still using 5 reps as an example. 87 minus 22.5, 64.5. Let's say 65%. That is going to be your starting point for week 1, leaving plenty of room for progression throughout the cycle. So that was an example just using 5s and the relative percentages for working on off 5 reps, but we might want to manipulate our rep scheme as the cycle progresses to complement slightly different traits. For example, more top end strength, we might want to use a slightly lower rep range, maybe a sets of 3s. And the process is actually very simple. We just need to plot where we would be on that scale, on that timeline throughout the cycle relative to the new percentage. So if we are working off 3s, our 3 rep max, going back to our chart, is going to be 93% of our 100%. And for example, if we wanted to make this change after our first meso cycle, so after our first 3 working weeks have gone, we're obviously left with 6 working weeks left. We would do 6 working weeks times 2.5%, because that's the progression that we still want to take, and we would take that away from 93. So we're left with 15. We take that away from 93 and we're at 78%. That is where we'd carry on if we wanted to change from 5s to 3s in our second meso cycle. Now, do not get me wrong, I do not think this is the be all and end all of all progression, and you're not going to make any progress unless you are following the exact percentage-based loading. I think that certain ways to prescribe load like RPE that allow you to self-regulate are actually very, very effective. Where this becomes more of a problem is when people are prescribing percentages which are seemingly accurate and perfect for people, but they've not been backed up with this theory, and they've not had foresight of how they're going to progress things throughout a longer period of time, and it leads to things like starting way too heavy, burning out, and not actually getting any effectiveness from that training cycle in general. Like I said earlier, the whole point of using a percentage is that it is the most accurate way of prescribing a load, and if you're not going to do it accurately, just use something like RPE, rate of perceived exertion, to allow for that self-regulation that we sometimes need as human beings, because we're not going to feel the same on every single day. So if we want fluctuation, we can get it from that. Let me know in the comments if that has helped you. Maybe you're a coach, maybe you're an athlete that just wants to understand a little bit more about why you've got these random numbers in your program. If you want to learn a little bit more about how you can work with me one-to-one, there's a link in the description, so you can check that out, and that will have everything you will need to know there. Thanks for your support. See you in the next one.